Flora, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure, Nassos. I'm looking forward to drilling down into Flora Macdonald's personality as well as her extraordinary life.
Absolutely. You were named after Flora Macdonald. What made you choose to write about her now?
It was serendipity. Well, perhaps not totally serendipity. I was searching for images to illustrate my last book, The Washingtons, a book about the marriage of George and Martha Washington. And in among many revolutionary portraits, Revolutionary War portraits, I suddenly encounter an image, an engraving of a portrait I know well. It's a portrait by Alan Ramsay of Flora Macdonald, this Scottish heroine of the Jacobite Rising, or the 45, as it's known in Scotland, the Jacobite Rising against the Crown of 1745. But that portrait, I knew, was painted roughly in 1747, 1749. So what was it doing in a... What was Flora, heroine of the Jacobite Rebellion, because she helped Bonnie Prince Charlie get back to France. What was it doing among these patriots trying to break from the crown in the 1770s and early 1780s? So I think, my God, I've never followed up on what happened to her in America. So I start sort of looking and find that, you know, she emigrates with her family. She has husband and 5 sons and 2 daughters too. They emigrate to North Carolina and buy they're economic migrants, so they buy a steading or 2 small farms way up the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. So, you know, that seems like life will be good. But then, oh dear, in April, having bought over the winter of 74, 75, in April 1775, the American Revolution breaks out. And now they have to choose whether to support the Crown or joining the Patriots. That is the dilemma. Do you become a patriot or a loyalist when you've only just arrived and all you want to do is
Build a life and find some economic stability.
Exactly.
And get away from everything that you were trying to get away from back in school.
Yeah, and so I thought this is so fascinating that I must write this book. And indeed, I was named after her. She was very much a local heroine in Venetia, where I grew up, and her statue is outside Inverness Castle. And it's been absolutely fascinating, if you like, an Atlantic voyage, because her story as a young woman lies all on the Atlantic coast of Britain, in the Western Isles and the west coast of Scotland. And then as a matron of 50, her life is on the east coast of America. So she has this extraordinary bicoastal life in which she navigates history and 2 wars, in effect, 2 civil wars. And throughout, you can cut Flora's story wherever you like. We only know of her from this moment when Bonnie Prince Charlie, a fugitive from the Hanoverian redcoats in the Western Isles or the Outer Hebrides, arrives at midnight. He arrives with her cousin and begs for her aid. Mm. And from this moment on, she becomes a young woman of 26 whose every sort of movement is documented. We're getting reports sent not only about Flora, not only to, and her exactly how she dresses up Bonnie Prince Charlie as her Irish maid called Betty Burke, as the two of them are rowed by a crew of Highland boatmen over to Skye and to escape redcoats, with Flora and a cousin, Neil, and the prince dressed up as Betty Burke.
It's a very, very evocative image. And something that recurs, and you pointed it out, was ever since that sort of seminal moment, really, for Flora, she becomes a woman of real intrigue, and people are fascinated by her. And there's this aura about her, because in every single account of every episode of some of the significant parts of her life, people comment on, this is a woman with great dignity, this is a woman of great courage, of great character, and so on. What was it, really, I think I'm getting at? What was it about Flora that made her that? Was it her upbringing, her experiences, or a combination of both? How do you think about it?
Flora had two strains, if you like, in her immediate family ancestry. Her father, who dies the next year after her birth, is noted for his, physical bravery, but is also canny. But there's also Flora's mother, whose father is known as the strong minister. He's a Presbyterian cleric. And there is, in Flora, I would say, a really strong Presbyterian faith which guides her actions just instinctively. This strong Presbyterian faith is seen when she comes to the aid of the prince, and later a government general, her captor, asks, "What made you do it?" And she says, "I would have done the same for you had you been in distress." And that is what people, and what I admire in Flora, that she is guided by a strong moral sense.
Flora does, as you say, display a great deal of moral courage, and it's perhaps slightly more obvious in the first instance where she is siding. She's helping Bonnie Prince Charlie in distress and going against the government when many of her family are actually for the government. The situation in America, fast forwarding several years, is slightly different, where she sides with the loyalists. How much of a choice did Flora have in terms of how she sided there? Because obviously her husband, Alan, raises a battalion. What do we know about perhaps conversations that they might have had, or how she actually felt, and what was the true motivation behind her decision to side with the loyalists? Was it a practical one? Was it an idealistic one? Was it a combination of both?
First of all, the most important thing is they've just arrived. Flora and Alan, 4 of their sons and 1 of their daughters, arrive in 1774. Revolution breaks out in 1775. Other Scots in different parts of America who have been settled since the 1760s or even the 1740s, they tend to join up as patriots. But those who've only just arrived cannot imagine that the crown, who is all-powerful, will not obviously break these ragamuffin patriots, so that they don't feel the powerful impetus to revolution.
They've just moved, and so they don't necessarily feel the same patriotism to the degree that people who've been there for a long time. And it seems impossible that, as you said, the Great British Army is going to be defeated by...
And they're being courted by Josiah Martin, this royal governor. So they've got the governor courting the whole of the Scots community, and the whole of Cross Creek, everyone's sort of ready. And also they want to show that, they are not Highland rebels, which was the taint from the 45. They want to be
loyal to the crown.
Loyal to
and
the
to be
crown.
seen to be loyal to the crown.
And they also had to swear, the males had to swear an oath of loyalty to the crown when they docked in North Carolina. And Highlanders at that time, they took these oaths quite seriously.
You mentioned Alan not being the best businessman. Did Flora's episode with the prince and the sort of, I don't know, would you call it minor or major celebrity, but the fame that followed that story afterwards, did it improve her marriage prospects or did it worsen them?
So going back to Flora and the Princess Betty Burke successfully landing in Skye and being helped by the chief's wife, this Macdonald's chief wife on Skye, Lady Margaret, Flora is taken prisoner. The prince, as we know, escapes. Alan, who's served in a local militia, isn't involved in anything. Flora is taken down to London, and she's questioned on the ship, and eventually, when she is, after 6 months or so, pronounced free, and no further action will be taken against her, she starts going out to Jacobite households. She's got no money. But when she eventually goes back to Scotland, she goes with a purse of £1,500, which is a subscription collected by these Jacobite ladies. There's a particular patron, Lady Primrose. And £1,500, you have to multiply it by 50 to get a even roughly accurate figure. So she's got a huge amount of money. And she goes back, and Alan, as the son of the factor, he's very much groomed to be his father's heir as factor. And that is indeed what occurs. But Alan is feckless, has ideas. It's not that he's wrong in embracing those ideas, but he's very bad at executing them, and he manages to lose all of Flora's money.
And even get into debt.
And gets into debt.
So he came from a good family.
Yeah.
But he was a bit feckless and careless and not certainly following in his father's footsteps, probably in the way that his father wanted him to. So he was a good match for Flora, but practically speaking, he ended up causing her a lot of problems just because he wasn't that competent.
He was incompetent, and Flora, it was Flora who secured positions for their sons, and I expect she also made the marriage of her daughter. It was she who got one son into the Marines, one son into the Bengal artillery, one son into the Indian Army. I mean, she wrote those letters and she acted, in effect, as the head of the family.
And just how great was her celebrity? So obviously this event happens and, it's published sort of in the Scots magazine, and then it starts to filter through to the London papers and so on and so forth. This is the sort of encounter with Bonnie Prince Charlie and helping him escape. How great was her? How great was her celebrity? How great was her fame? And, there's even sort of a point in the book where you write about when she was received in America, she was received with great adulation. This really was someone who was very prominent. So can you just contextualize that a little bit? How great was her celebrity in the aftermath of helping Bonnie Prince Charlie escape?
There were other women who had been important in the story of the 45, but on the whole, they were rebels who acted to raise the clan in different parts of Scotland and became prisoners too. But Flora, she did stand alone because it was her clemency to the prince rather than her encouraging anyone to take up arms or levy arms. You had Voltaire telling her story in his book, The Age of Louis XIV and XV. Dr. Johnson, who publishes his journal of his tour. But there are crazy things like the prince's dress as Betty Burke. There's a dressmaker in Edinburgh who makes all these copies. Women wear it as an emblem of defiance. He makes all these copies and they're worn. It just keeps on rolling, and I think it never goes away, even though it's the image of her as this young woman helping this glamorous, handsome young prince in distress, and it's but on an extraordinary adventure with the stormy waves and and that boat ride. I mean, most people today, if they know about Flora Macdonald, tend to think that Flora rode the prince herself, which is, it's 30 nautical miles from the Western Isles to Skye, and it's at midnight. No, there was a crew of 4 and a helmsman. So that never goes away, the romance of the story.
Yeah, so she was effectively, this is a remarkable episode, this sort of helping Prince Charlie, but in a wider context. Over the course of several decades, there's power shifting hands, there's lots going on, so it's almost like at the centre of this circle of events in this episode, in a wider context of things over across a number of years. Here is this remarkable woman who seems to charm everyone and sort of make a huge impression on everyone, and that leads to a myth, a legend, and all these stories sort of cropping up. Because you mentioned so many in the book, things that there are some instances where you have to dispel, there are some instances where there's hearsay, but you can tell, and from all the, the songs, the stories, the myths that get spun about Flora, there's something that really captured the imagination about her.
Yes, and every Walker's shortbread tin and every Walker's shortbread packet still today has the marvellous painting on it, even in the small rosette of Flora's farewell to the prince. But it's part of it that you walk up the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and there are a million Floras on shortbread tins. And in North Carolina now, and generally in America, she's certainly the only loyalist who attracts admiration. She's becoming an important part of the Revolutionary War story because she exemplifies, if you like, someone who had good reason, in her view, to vote with her feet for the crown and encourage those around her to do likewise.
So we have this dramatic myth and legend and something that continues over the ages. But the practical reality of her life, there was also a lot of difficulty, struggle, suffering.
Yeah.
Being taken prisoner. This sort of intrigue and situation she got into, being married to Alan, of course, and then in the US she had a very hard time for a number of years, didn't she?
Yeah.
When the war began, Alan sort of was captured as prisoner, and she sort of had to hide for a couple of years. She struggled quite a lot in her life.
Oh, hugely. And, in her early life, we know the outlines. Obviously, her father died when she was an infant. I mean, she was maximum sort of 4 or 5 when he died. Then her mother remarries. Her mother is a shadowy figure. She marries a very canny and fascinating second husband, who's a Sky man, and that's why they moved to Sky.
This is Hugh MacDonald.
Hugh MacDonald, I think he's canny with money and has a good property. He's a constant in Flora's life, a canny expert at speaking with a forked tongue.
She seems to be surrounded by quite a few of these characters.
Yes.
And possibly learning from them and developing her own ability to be clever and because she impresses, again, coming back to all these conversations that she has with people, she seems to impress everyone and say things in such a way that she sort of captures their imagination, even if they may not like the side that she's taken.
Yeah, and as an example of how frustrating it was for the government troops in the Western Isles, in Skye, to catch the prince, they would go and use quite forcible tactics to extract information, and they'd admit, oh yes, he was in Corriedale, this Glen, and so where is he now? Oh, I don't know where he went then. The information they give is perfectly correct, but they always give it so that I'm chasing after something, and in the meantime he's got away to some other part.
Is there any record from diaries perhaps, or from people making accounts of Flora's emotional state? Was she feeling anxious, fearing for her life, hearing stories about they're going and interrogating people over here, over there, knowing that soon, perhaps they would uncover information that would lead them to her? What do we know about in this period of interrogations where they're hunting the prince and trying to, find out who is helping him? What do we know about her emotional state and how she's, thinking about things?
Yes, so we know they part from each other at the inn, the public house or the whiskey house at Portree, and then she's on. She goes home to Armadale, her stepfather and mother's house. She is then taken prisoner there and taken on this ship. She tells a completely false story to begin with, how Betty Burke, she was this Irish woman who asked me to take her over to Skye, and she was looking for her husband. And then later she sort of tells the truth but omits to mention her cousin, for instance, who's key because he's been hiding the prince in this glen, and then she omits to mention her stepfather and so on. And then she's being taken down, as are most of the of those who have been proved to help the prince, to London, and the ship stops at Leith, the port for Edinburgh, to be sort of repaired and refitted. And all these Jacobite ladies in Leith, completely thrilled. They come on. She can't go on shore, but they come on, and they thrilled to meet her. It's rather like I danced with the man who danced with the girl who danced with the Prince of Wales.
And at this point, she already is something
absolutely
of a celebrity.
Within weeks. And in London they know about her, and Horace Walpole in his letters is who loves gossip is being told about this young girl, and
Were there rumours about her sort of having
an affair,
having had an affair with the prince and
yes,
that type of thing?
in some newspapers, including that she cured him of the itch. She was very worried in this hut at midnight that she risked her reputation, which is key for getting married. But extraordinary how she preserved it. And they were dancing, the ladies with the ship's officers one day, and Flora was very much treated almost as a grandee on this ship. And they were dancing with the ship's officers, and they said, you must dance with us. But she said, my dancing days are done until I have word that the prince is safe in France. By now she was resigned to what came, although she, played a brilliant hand down in London. And even though we don't know exactly what form the interrogation took, it was pretty nasty. So we don't know exactly what was said there, but we have her declaration, if you like, the evidence she gave to General Campbell on the Furnace, this ship. But later, when she was interrogated after in America, after the Highland March on to the coast, we know that she gave a spirited defence of herself to the Patriot Committee, which, so I think we can assume that that just like in all her dealings, she was spirited. I think in America that expression, street smarts, she had street smarts. And she certainly, as you say, knew how to charm her captors, or in America, her this extremely hostile Patriot Committee. I would not like to have been interrogated by them.
While Alan was taken prisoner, Flora became quite ill, didn't she?
Yes.
And so we're aware of sort of a period of time where she was in hiding, she wasn't well, and that probably would have been one of the most difficult phases of her life. Would you say
yes.
that?
Yes, because so they don't know what's happened. The Highland Army is set off, and with sort of a lot of, bagpipes and, waving their swords and calling God, King George, and broadswords and so on. But then they're up here in the in at Cross Creek, and Flora at her home.
Is this still in the plantation house, or she's already?
She's still in the plantation house, and as far as I know, even though she was said to be in hiding, she, from her own narrative, however, what she says is that she had a serious fever, possibly brought on. I mean, all of the Cross Creek is taken over by sort of Patriot militia. And then she says night robbers, as she called them, so come and strip the plantation of horses, but it seems like also of the silver and all the obvious things
Everything
you
valuable.
would take. The truth is that it's a time in which she has no protection. She tells us herself that she goes to visit other Highland wives and women, and they upbraid her, and because it was her husband who persuaded their husbands
to join up.
The
battalion.
It's very tough times, and eventually, by the time her husband and son are exchanged in 1778, it's he who comes down, who charters a ship and comes down and negotiates with the Patriot government to get Flora and her daughter and the four grandchildren out of North Carolina. And Flora leaves with £40 sterling worth of property.
From 1500 to 40, they'd gone in search of a better economic situation. And it hadn't necessarily improved.
Yeah.
She then goes back to, I think she lands in London, and then eventually she returns to Skye. What are the latter years of her life like? And is there still a sense of adulation back in Skye and respect for Flora for what she's done in her life? Also, what is the reality of her situation? Is it sort of quite a humble last decade or so of life up there in Skye?
By this time, she's suffering badly from rheumatoid arthritis, not least because she broke the other arm. I mean, she's broken both arms. She had one winter in Nova Scotia, and it was the coldest winter on record. And then she makes for Skye because she and Alan had left their younger daughter, who was about 8, in the care of sort of family or friends, at least on Rasay, this island. So she's returning to see Fanny, this younger daughter. She also wants to see her youngest son. In fact, he's just left for India because he wants a career in the army and is stationed in Sumatra and does very well. Eventually becomes a lieutenant colonel, but he also sends back every year a pension of £100 to Flora, which is key. So she's sort of perching, and then eventually Alan comes back. The war's ended, and because he served in this provincial regiment, they're given land, they're given bounty land. He, I'm afraid, fails at sort of farming this land and comes back, and together he and Flora, effectively with this £100 a year from Johnny, the son out in Sumatra, they rent this this farm, which is a very small. That's where she's living when she dies. The year before she dies, a Skye man who's made good, and Scots are great emigrants when they don't land in America at the outset of the Revolutionary War. And so Sir John Macpherson, who's a minister's son from Skye, he was out in Bengal and was acting governor for a time. And he's her son Johnny's superior. He comes back to visit family, and he hears Flora's sort of stories of America. He knows her story of the 45. He is an intimate in London of the Prince of Wales. That's George III's son, later Prince Regent George IV. And Macpherson persuades Flora to write down these two narratives of her adventures and imprisonment. In other words, it's a memorial of her suffering. These are classic documents of that time. You would write a memorial of your sufferings or your losses, and then you would petition for relief. Government usually, and Allen and all the Scots loyalists wrote memorials and petitioned government. Sir John tells the Prince of Wales about her sufferings and her penurious state. Flora obtains from the Prince of Wales, from this Hanoverian Prince of Wales, a pension of £50 a year. Bonnie Prince Charlie has never acknowledged, since remembered, sent her any recognition, let alone cash, to thank her. And here is this Hanoverian prince providing her with £50 a year. And so she dies in 1790. The reason, if you like, for the Prince of Wales being interested by this is it is the first, really, of the Hanoverians to see the advantages of incorporating Stuart history into Hanoverian history, and so cementing the Hanoverians on the throne. And he continues this. He buys the Stuart jewels, he buys the Stuart papers, and his final marvellous act is to visit in great splendour and wearing an enormous kilt. And Sir Walter Scott is the master of ceremonies, if you like, and says to everyone, including all lowland Scots, prominent Scots, who don't normally didn't at that time wear Highland dress. The king wants to see everyone in kilts, so everyone sort of puts on these kilts and plaids and cock feathers in their bonnets, and the whole thing sparks a sort of delirium of tartan romantic Scotland, and all these songs are written, Charlie is my darling, and and it carries on from there, and later, of course, Queen Victoria buys Balmoral, and really romantic Scotland never goes away.
And the myth that sort of perpetuates itself,
yes,
and kind of keeps going and becomes almost interwoven in many different aspects of Scottish culture and also British, to an extent, what you were saying about the Hanoverians and the Stuarts sort of looking to weave that story and that narrative into their history, and her being such a crucial part of that story that it was important enough to sort of make that gesture and weave her story into the story of a sort of continuum.
So the story of the Prince and Flora, which began by being a desperate affair with the redcoats a mile off and the Prince in danger of his life, and it was Flora who saved him. Yeah, really, that sort of desperate tension of that week they spend just ahead of of the redcoats getting him away has now been, translated into Victorian, stately sort of romance. And by the time I grew up as a child in the 1960s, I mean, everywhere there were tartan boxes with Flora's portrait.
In the prologue, you write that what you discovered over the course of producing this book was sort of stranger than the Jacobite fiction that you grew up with.
Yes.
If you could sort of summarize to finish up, what did you really learn, or what did you learn that was different about Flora over the course of the journey? What really stuck out to you about this myth, this legend, this sort of woman that was, dramatized and glorified, and all these sort of stories were told about her? What was it that you got at the end of this process of running this book?
Well, there's a tag, if you like, and it's well-behaved women seldom make history. But in this case, a well-behaved woman truly did make history. And the prince, Alan, others, if you like, are not people that I greatly admire, but I admire Flora for both for her moral courage throughout, the moral courage she displayed throughout her life, and also for the extreme intelligence with which she navigated a world in which patronage was key, and she placed her children extremely well. And also, I admire the intelligence with which she navigated the vagaries of the American Revolutionary War. And I wish that Flora had the good education in Edinburgh that she had provided for Johnny, because often with women in the 18th century, you wish that they had the advantage of education, and you wonder what they would have done with that. She's also, I mean, I probably haven't stressed, but she, she was, if you had, and Johnson and Boswell make this clear as well, others do, that she was good fun. You had good crack with her, to use a sort of Highland expression. So she was a lot of fun to be with. But when we meet her, she's a young gentlewoman of basic education, and we follow her through the most remarkable adventures. But you can cut her story wherever you like, and she's always the same. Her character is formidable in a way, and it's been a privilege to spend these years with her.
Yeah, well, she's a remarkable woman. It's a remarkable book. Thank you, Flora. It was a pleasure chatting to you about Flora Macdonald.
Thank you, Nessus. It's been terrific.
The book Pretty Young Rebel comes out on the 15th of September, is that right?
That's right, yeah. And although this is only a proof, Bloomsbury, I have to say, have provided a marvellous taster for the book, which will be in this Schiaparelli pink also.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Flora.